in conversation with Mel Perry. What is your deaf journey and how does it relate to your creativity? How do you feel about a Deaf Creative Manifesto for Wales and what do you think should be included within it?
So this is the journal that I've been using for my writing, my journaling free writing, exploring my maternal grandparents' stories. And what I've been doing is just kind of wetting and colouring the pages before I write them. I think it kind of helps with the block, the intimidation of a plain white page. It can be like, ooh, what am I going to write? So I tend to colour the pages. And in preparing to talk to Cheryl today, I thought, well, I'll colour my pages in this particular journal, and they're coloured pink and orange. And what I found myself doing was a swirl of colour in the shape of an ear. And that's on the left-hand side of the spread. And on the right-hand side of the spread is the swirl of some more colour in the shape of an ear. And then a kind of blue and green gunk, which is the kind of chronic ear infection, the cholesteatoma that I've got in my middle ear. And then the left-hand page, the good ear, which is my left ear, is not written over, so I can just enjoy the red and the orange and the yellow and the brown of the ear. And then the right-hand page, which is representing my right ear, that's got writing on it. And their headlines, their words, their phrases related to my hearing loss and how I came by my hearing loss and how I live with that hearing loss. And that was very moving. That was very powerful to write that, and I'll read some of it shortly. But it occurred to me it's the first time that I've actually kind of practice what I preach, I suppose, in that I found myself thinking, well, I'm going to see what happens if I put some water and paint on the pages and think about my ear, see what emerges. And when the paint was dry and I started to write the words, all of the memories and the significant times in my life that relate to my hearing loss kind of came through. So I've got a piece of text which just kind of begins to tell the story and then just has some phrases in it, and I think I'll need to work on it because this is, as I said, this is the first time that I've gone this deeply into what I have to say about my hearing loss. I had measles when I was 7. To have measles at 7 seems so old. To have had measles in 1965 seems such a long time ago. Measles, they gave me my abiding disability, but it's only recently that I've regarded it as such. It was the summer of 1965, July, and the annual summer school fete was due to take place on the following school half day. My friend Kate had included me in their family group entry of the Wizard of Oz to the fancy dress parade. Kate's mother, Rosemary, had made my costume, a spectacular construction of chicken wire, card, cotton cloth, that all inside with a tin foil skin on the outside. As I tried on my Tin Man costume, my mother looked at my back, saw it covered in vrech goch, red spots. I felt hot too. I was barred from going to school and taking part in the parade. The disappointment was deep, to miss the friendship, the fun, the carnival, the parade, the performance. Today, I still grab those opportunities that might fade in my hands as the lights go up on a stage. When my mother died in November 2014, I was not going to pull out of performing in a comedy choir supporting Just Good Friends production of The Vicar of Dibley at Christmas, some 10 days later. In the choir, I focused on the spotlight from the balcony as its light seared the dark of the stage and hall. I sang Spaceman Came Travelling for that disappointed 7-year-old child who spent a week in bed in the summer of 1965. My friends, the Gillams, the family, the Wizard of Oz group, won, of course, and they bought me a sticky rock lolly with part of my share of the winnings. That was some compensation for lying in the dark on sunny days, traipsing along the landing to look in the bathroom mirror and see spots on my eyelids. I think it was some time before my deafness became an issue for me, but I remember being quite a kind of surly, shy, quiet child. I've got photographs of me standing alongside my mother out on the breakwater at Fishguard Harbour with a hood, my coat hood over my head, kind of huddled into my mum. And I've always been the observer, the watcher, listener to a certain extent, but certainly the observer of people, not necessarily joining in conversations. In pub conversations, I couldn't hear. Joke punchlines, I couldn't hear. My own world was muffled, not silent, but muffled, always as if I had my head in a bucket. Lessons in class, I couldn't hear. Learning to swim was restricted. I had to keep my head up. Cotton wool helped a little bit, but it was a faff. I was never allowed to learn to dive, never allowed to jump in to the water, that is. I jumped into many other things in my life, but not into deep, real water. So I spent 43 years compensating for what was identified as 75% hearing loss in my right ear. I spent a lot of my childhood and my adolescence having operations on my ear to kind of reduce or deal with the source of the infection that had been left by the measles. And measles is renowned for leaving eye infections, middle ear infection, very common. And I think there are probably a lot of people of my age, my generation, who've had this experience of having measles kind of pre the vaccination period. So I had a lot of operations. I had one when I was, it was after my O-level, so it was about 1974, 75, and spent about 2 weeks in Llangwelly in Carmarthen, having a mastoidectomy, having my mastoid kind of cleaned out, the mastoid being the bone at the back of the ear. And I had a sketch for a long time that my father did of me with this sort of bandage around my head and a huge pad of wadding over my right ear. And I remember I came from Pembrokeshire, and I just found there was a lot of Welsh spoken in the hospital, and I found the nurses and the staff different. That was difficult, and I remember wanting to go home. I want to go home. I can go home when I've eaten. I refuse to eat. I want to go home. I can go home when I've eaten. I eat chicken soup. I can go home. I don't want to place the order for tomorrow's meals for another patient. I am going home. I remember that sensation of I was only going to be allowed to go home when I started eating. And I remember my mother's gloves on the bedside cabinet, And that was a sign that she hadn't left to go home after visiting. She'd just gone off to talk to staff on the ward, but she was coming back. So if her gloves were there, that was always a good sign. And then that kind of cleared things up for a while, for a couple of years. And then I remember when I was in Goldsmiths in London from 1978, I remember I had kind of almost permanent infection coming from my left ear. And, you know, it's not particularly nice. Infection, noisome discharge, weep, dry, clean, weep, discharge. I think it's strange that a word that sounds as if it relates to sound and noise actually means an offensive smell, and to use it in the context of the word noisome in the context of somebody who has hearing loss is kind of an irony there for me. So I was booked to have another operation in 1984. Oh, I should say, the mastodectomy in 1975 on Merlin Ward in Glangwili. My consultant surgeon was Mr. Salathiel Morgan, fondly known as Slasher, but he was very good and very gentle. And I learned to lip read his, "What is your name?" He whispered into my right ear. "What is your name?" He whispered into my right ear as his left hand reached around the back of my neck to close my left ear. And I was swivelling my neck and my eyes to the right as much as I could to read his lips. So that was Slasher Morgan. And then in 1984, I was booked to have another operation, and I did. And I just started working for the Health Authority Health Promotion Department, and then I had to have a month off work. And that operation was a success. That one cleaned it up, and I had 6 monthly follow-up, and then I began to have annual follow-up. And every year I would go to outpatients, the ENT outpatients, and they would check my ear and ask me if it was okay, and it was dry and clean and it wasn't smelly anymore, and everything was just great. But I was aware that, and this isn't until my adult life, that I've become aware that I like to have people on my left-hand side. If I'm in a meeting, I will sit where I can see and hear the chair of the meeting. I will address people towards the left. When I go to the theatre, I like to sit on the right-hand side of the audience so that my left ear, my good ear, is hearing the action on the stage. And so I've always found ways of compensating, ways of managing my hearing loss. As it turned out to be 75% of hearing loss in my right ear. 30 years of annual outpatient checks. They stopped when my mother was ill. I ignored the appointment letters. I became a DNA. I was sent a GIT letter, get in touch. I ignored the letters. My case was closed. And then the infection began to return. But before this, back in 2008, I think it was, Dad was trying some incredibly expensive kind of private little hearing aids, and he put them on, and he said, I can hear my shoes scraping on the carpet, I can hear my keys jangling in my pocket, I'm not going to have these, I don't need these. And I took one of them, tiny little pyramidal thing with a thread, and put it into my ear, into my right ear, and saw my mother's surprise on her face as she saw my face lit up. Because as I spoke, I could hear my voice for the first time clearly it was no longer in it muffling in its bucket. I could hear my voice. So that was 2008. I spent so many years of my adult life without any hearing aid. And my mother she felt guilty for not kind of pursuing it with me. But I was kind of quiet and had never complained. So I set about going to audiology, getting a hearing test, having the extent of hearing loss identified, and getting a hearing aid. So here I am now with a hearing aid, and people, I forget about it a lot of the time when I'm wearing it. I feel undressed if I don't have it. And in fact, yesterday I couldn't find it. Found it in the bed this morning. Didn't have it on yesterday. And as the day went on, I was starting to feel more and more kind of naked without it. And I was in a shop in town, and I was aware of somebody coming very close and almost kind of invading my personal space. And if I'd had the hearing aid on, I would have been able to turn and see them. And I'd been able to hear them before they came too close. So that's a kind of reminder of how important it is for me. So I was due to have an appointment, the ENT appointment in October 2020, and the appointment was cancelled, and I absolutely understand why it was cancelled, but it was, and anyway, I've kind of reactivated, got myself back into the system again. Wasn't in trouble for being a non-attender, thank goodness. But as an artist, as a writer, as a performer, because I'm a spoken word performer, there's an irony in that, isn't there? I'm aware still as a spoken word performer that I will address the left-hand side of the room. That is always more easily, and I have to remember to include the other side of the room. I've never really written about my deafness, and as I said earlier, preparing for this today, and painting the pages, writing on the pages, typing this up has been the closest that I've got to really exploring my deafness. So now I do see myself as having a disability, and I hope that I have more understanding of other people with hearing loss. I had a couple of very dear friends, Maggie Hampton and Celia Saywell, who used to come to Unessentially with me on a writing group every year, and we would just have, I can't sign and I can't understand, I can't read sign, but through the week with Maggie would be able to grasp some of it, and we would just have fantastic silent conversations in the kitchen while we were cooking, and I learned a lot about looking directly at people and people being able to read my lips and me being able to read them. So, and I'm interested in the kind of connections between being able to see and being able to hear, and if something is a bit blurred visually, then it's harder for me to hear it. I remember I was performing with the Carmarthen Symphonic Wind Band. I've had some of my poetry set to music with the band, and in rehearsal I would need to make sure that I could, I would stand on, I would be stage right, so the conductor was in the middle and he was to my left and I could see and hear him, but I was very aware that I needed to be able to see and hear him bringing me in. And I sing as well. I'm a tenor in Sweet Harmony Choir, community choir, and I always like to have the tenors on the fellow tenors on my left hand side, and if it turns round, or if I'm on the other side of that group and I can't hear them properly, that's a bit of a difficulty. So even though I've got the hearing aid, it can only kind of compensate a little bit for the amount of hearing loss that I've got. It can't bring it back. It can only augment sound a little bit for me, but it is a help. This has been an amazing experience, actually, to really go into the kind of origin of my hearing loss, and how that's affected me in my life. You know, I think it contributed to me zoning out in school. You know, wanting to learn, but actually missing a lot of stuff, but not realising that I was missing a lot of stuff. But then not doing particularly well in exams because I'd missed so much. And I suppose I was a late developer, really. Didn't get going until after my degree, when I was probably in smaller groups, and it began to make sense to me. And probably I worked out then that if I sat on in a certain position and was able to see and hear the tutor or the lecturer, then I would improve. So that tends to be what I'll do. And what's happened in the last, 5 or 6 years is that I've become much more assertive about saying I would like to sit I'd like to sit in a certain position. Before, I just used to look at a table and think, okay, well, I'll just sit wherever there's a space. But now I'll actually ask, particularly my husband, I'll ask him to move so that I can sit with people on my left and I can see and hear. So that's the story of my hearing loss and living with it. Thank you.